Last week we dived into the conundrum of the Dead Space necromorphs and if we could consider them zombies or not. Well, within the gigantic fictional realm of body horror science fiction, do we have a similar but way more chaotic relative to the marker's influence? We are going to be asking, does the flood of the Halo franchise count as zombies? Can this ancient sealed away race of precursor pocket sand really be categorized as what you would consider the zombie archetype? I put up a poll on the YouTube community page and my Twitter, and the results were, it's still kinda split down the middle. People love to classify classes or types of creatures and monsters within certain groups for ease of discussion and or scientific research. Who doesn't love overly explaining fictitious media in a series with more ups and downs than the Halo franchise itself? Then I, and today's returning special guest, Hidden Xperia. Today, we are discussing the question, are Halo's flood zombies or not? Today's video will be a bit of a short form, two sides arguing their case, with I, Zach S, aka Wow Such Gaming, proficient in zombie history, lore, and studies into game development, on the side of the flood, not to be considered zombies, while Hidden Xperia, more proficient in everything Halo inside and out, on how the flood should be considered zombies. So get your rings on and your guiltiness sparked, and let's get into this. So to start things off on my side, I'll go ahead and state why the flood shouldn't be labeled as zombies, and I may or may not retread some ground that I covered in the Dead Space video, so sorry to my flood brethren, but I might be stepping on your... Can I call those toes? Sure, they're toes. With the flood being genetic leftovers of the precursors corrupted into a fine powder and administered millennia ago to mutate themselves and the Forerunners infecting basically all organic life, the Halos nuked everything galaxy-wide so the flood could have no food and would die out as planets were repopulated by AI. But the flood would return after breaching containment hundreds of thousands of years later, and from just that small sample did they break out and cause hell all over again. The flood has an expansive library of forms it can go through, from spores to infection forms to combat forms and even pure breeds. The flood has a wide arsenal at its disposal due to its methods of repurposing biomass. And at a first glance, looking at the hordes of the flood once they have started to arise, it's easy to say how some people would label this genetic nightmare a zombie threat. Sure, the basic combat form can fall in line with the zombie stereotype, considering it's a recently deceased body that has been taken over and attacking any non-infected individuals nearby in order to kill them. Another form that can be signified in another zombie-like style in a mutative fashion is the carrier, causing a body to bloat exponentially till a gigantic empty sac consumes the top half of the body, bursting with spores, fluids, and infection forms upon anything that either attacks it or draws near it. It's with these two admittedly common forms amongst the hordes where the similarities with the zombie archetype come to an end. They might be technically reanimated corpses to fit a purpose of killing and infecting other dead bodies by the masses, but they aren't there as separate undead entities serving a mindless goal of just consumption and infection. They can retain knowledge of its host to use weapons, as well as use its mutated forms to more greatly attack others, leap long distances, pilot ships, and more. But their deadliest capabilities come not by the stereotypical numbers and hordes, but the biomass of these numbers coming together to direct these hordes. They have a hive mind intelligence that grows stronger the more biomass its legions achieve, as well as what starts this universal process. The flood, in its beginning and ending forms, are anything but what I would consider a zombie. The infection form, aka pod infector, aka floor popcorn, are what are unleashed and most frequently flooding an area. These being pure forms of the flood stemmed from corpses turned to dust, refined, and a whole bunch of other sci-fi mumbo-jumbo over hundreds of thousands of years ago. They will hop into living and dead bodies alike and hijack them to turn them into special forms, but they don't infect people in the generic way of biting a victim or spreading a virus through bodily fluids. Instead, they literally just penetrate a body with its tendrils and instantly start taking control. Even long dead bodies with no functioning organs can be utilized by these infection forms. It will, in a very similar fashion to the necromorphs' efforts to create a brethren moon, will accumulate biomass by the millions in order to combine it into creating the hive mind-like intelligence known as the grave mind. While the flood may be mindless like zombies in its beginnings, once once a grave mind has been born, let's just say the Leroy Jenkins stratagem of the common zombie where they just kind of yeet themselves in an uncoordinated effort is pretty much out the window. The grave mind will direct every single flood unit across multiple planets, telling them where to gather, where to go, whom to swarm, flanking positions, and directing an army via telepathic means. For sapient creatures like humans that are captured by the flood, their minds will be invaded by the spore as it steals every memory and piece of information it can. Using the brightest and most intelligent that it can get, it will, in its earliest stages, rip these minds away from combat forms so it can use them to accumulate the big-brained individuals into proto-grave minds so it can accelerate its hive mind growth. But also does this so it can utilize these intelligent people's knowledge so the flood can attain vital information like the locations of further food sources like Earth, the knowledge to pilot advanced ships, and hell, something like nuclear launch codes. The flood, using memories and intelligence to their advantage, even near its start, is terrifying, but also something zombies have shown kind of to do on an individual scope, but never to such a heightened degree. Romero zombies retain some kind of modicum of their past self, but the flood is capable of completely reusing the information their former consciousness had, coordinating the flood to extreme degrees where they could be taught to fight as battalions, pilot vehicles to precise manners, and just basically be giant meat suit puppets for an ever-expanding intelligence that wants to consume all it can across the cosmos, even siding with the uninfected at points to ensure its race's own survival. As the flood has more biomass to pull from, will it construct pure forms? Basically, new organisms devoid of remnants of bodies of the Sangheli, the brutes, and humans, and instead coming into their own frames, basically becoming their own species, creating bulky resistant tank forms, spiky projectile shooting ranged forms, nightmare fuel, wall and ceiling scaling stalker forms, and tentacle grasping other forms, and pull from its gathered flesh to morph these new monsters to easily overwhelm survivors. Hell, even looking at these Lovecraftian horrors would make you think of many other antagonistic entities other than zombies. You wouldn't look at these and think, oh, that's a zombie. The flood is also just more than the combat forms that people would label as that zombie. Now, zombies are popular for having different forms that they can mutate into, do not get me wrong, but the special variations of many of these zombie franchises are not handpicked by a godlike presence to be set out into the world. Instead, most of the time these variations are more in line with being created via pre-existing medical or environmental conditions, spurring the zombie virus to mutate differently within people at random. Stronger forms aren't going to be organized in a manner like the floods for a common zombie apocalypse. It's the difference between randomized chaos and coordinated order. The flood proves it's more than a zombie outbreak by moving its various forms like chess pieces to exterminate and encapsulate enemies. As the flood's biomass compiles on surfaces, it will produce spores that, when inhaled, will infect organisms to transform human bodies into creating eggs of infection forms, to burst from the frames of people to create more of these little floor popcorns. These spores can be made to be pumped into a planet's atmosphere via spore mountains, as the grave mind can even launch flood dispersal pods to areas to disperse these spores further from orbit. Basically, biochemical warfare to infect more and create pure forms of infection that create the half-breeds that go back into pure breeds. All of these kinds of efforts being way more than any kind of zombie efforts I have ever seen. You can make the case for Resident Evil, but zombies are usually the results of biochemical warfare or the attempts of making a biochemical weapon by regular sapient human beings, not the zombies themselves doing the chemical attacks. The Flood are way too aggressive to an intelligent degree that they can use everything that we have against us and are far from the rather shallow threat zombies impose. To summarize, the Flood's humble beginnings and its freshly made combat forms can be the only things remotely close to a zombie outbreak. The Flood doesn't consume the flesh of the living like a cannibal corpse, merely recycles it after it pilots it, repurposing not only biomass, but the minds behind that mass to make its hive mind smarter and more prone to allowing its infantry to be more knowledgeable and coordinate better. Its hive mind workings even more pronounced than Dead Space's marker in necromorphs and twice as expansive. Meaning what I've said before, with them, it's magnified with Halo's Flood. Zombies have a limit within their slow, individualistic frame. A zombie usually relies on its strengths of having good durability and numbers, but that is just something the Flood already has in spades. Basically, zombies are like 5% of this galaxy-destroying threat's DNA, but I don't think Halo is parading around with these DNA results. I used to get in trouble for always using the Z word, but with this video, I figured out I'm 5% zombie. Morning, Flood. What up, my zombie? Look, it's got 95% unadulterated science fiction horror that is way beyond that minuscule zombie identity that no doubt did give it some inspiration. But with that said, I think it's time to see the other side of the aisle and hand things off to today's special guest as he discusses why the Flood should be considered zombies. And we have the aficionado of Halo history himself, Hidden Xperia.
So, are the Flood zombies? Without a shadow of a doubt, yes. In fact, they actually have a lot more in common with conventional zombies than I think most people realize. So, let's compare them to the baseline traits of a zombie to see just how similar they are. Firstly, the obvious one. They can reanimate the dead. As long as the host has an intact nervous system, it can theoretically be infected. So if you want to get real traditional, an infection form could wander into a cemetery and, as long as a host in a grave was fresh enough, reanimate them into a combat form. Alternatively though, a host doesn't even need to be infectable to be used by the Flood. If they are deemed uninfectable, or not worth expending an infection form to infect, then the host's body can simply be used as biomass to help spread the Flood infection and create a litany of biomass-related structures and entities, from spore mountains to grave mines, and even entire hives. On that note, like a typical zombie, the Flood hunger for flesh, but not just human flesh. Any biomass that can be used to further their spread. Humans, elites, brutes, prophets, grunts, hell, even jackals. If biomass exists, the Flood will use it. And speaking of furthering their spread, the Flood parasite is highly contagious. As a famous elite once said, one single Flood spore can destroy a species. And he's right. For a host to be infected, the Flood supercell needs to be implanted within them. Now, this cell is the core of the Flood itself, and the most common way that we see it being spread is through infection forms that bury into the chests of dead or alive hosts, implant the supercell to begin the transformation into a combat form, and then tap into their nervous system to gain control of their bodies. But infection forms aren't the only means of transmission. The mixing of bodily fluids allows for supercell transmission as well. Combat forms have even been known to bite hosts that they don't think they can kill, which leads to infection, albeit with a slower conversion rate than with an infection form. And the Flood can even go airborne as well. Once Flood hives have been produced, spores that contain the supercell are secreted into the air and can be transmitted simply by being inhaled by a host. Even breathing near a Flood hive is potentially very lethal. Once infected, the Flood are incredibly mobile, even more so than the most mobile of zombies like the Rage Infected, who, yes, I know, aren't technically zombies, but we'll let that one pass. Not only can combat forms sprint, but they can also leap great distances to get the drop on potential hosts from above. Despite their biomass technically rotting and decaying, they're really strong as well. Hits with their arm-grown whips can easily be fatal, and they even have the strength to board vehicles. Like regular zombies, they're also uncommunicative, at least once fully infected. Partially infected hosts, like Private Wallace Jenkins for example, have been known to retain their sense of self and ability to speak in the past, but for the most part, combat forms are unemotional and uncommunicative. They let out the typical growls and screams of regular zombies, but their only deviation here is that the Gravemind is able to speak through them, particularly combat forms, almost using them as like mobile speakers for its infectious logic and philosophy. As we've already outlined, the Flood are extremely violent. They shoot, they whip, they claw, they bite, and hell, they even drive tanks. You'll be hard-pressed to find any kind of zombie that's violent in more ways than the Flood are. One thing they absolutely aren't, however, is clumsy. In fact, they're quite the opposite. Yeah, they might shamble around when idle, but because of how the Flood's hive mind intelligence works, they are an intelligent zombie right from the get-go, and they only get more intelligent as the infection spreads, more knowledge is consumed, and more central intelligences like Graveminds are created. That said though, they have some extreme weaknesses. Again, just like many conventional zombies, fire, or any kind of weapon that emits extreme heat, is the bane of the Flood. Covenant glassing beams that rain down superheated plasma are highly efficient at quelling larger scale outbreaks, but on a smaller scale, flamethrowers, firebombs, and energy swords are perfect for cutting through the rotting biomass and destroying all spores and supercells the corpses may emit. Shotguns, particularly ones that are loaded with buckshot shells, are, again, just like regular zombies, highly effective with the Flood as well. The high power and widespread impact of the pellets make them perfect for cutting through their rotting flesh like butter. But, at the same time, the infected target will keep coming unless it's hit in a certain area. Of course, fire completely neutralizes a combat form, but with ballistics, it doesn't matter how many limbs you blow off or how many mags you dump into its biomass. If you don't destroy the infection form that's in its chest, it won't stop. Shooting the infection form out of a combat form's chest is essentially the Flood equivalent of headshotting a regular zombie. It will drop it immediately. But if not, the Flood will remain a highly persistent threat, spreading the supercell any way they can and consuming entire planets with ease if left unchecked. Hell, even if they are countered as the Foreigners did many years ago during the Foreigner Flood War, it doesn't matter. They can spread through an entire galaxy like wildfire.
Well, I mean, that is his opinion on the Flood being zombies. Do you agree with this Halo expert or the zombie expert? We will leave it up to you down in the comments. Big thanks to Hidden Xperia for hopping in and giving his 2 cents. Check out his channel for Halo and SCP content and tell him I sent ya. Shout out to you for watching, and my donators over on Patreon as well as YouTube channel members for pitching in to be on this cool list here. Until next time, I'm Zach S, aka Weinstock Gaming. Stay happy, stay healthy, stay iconic, and stay well.